Hello and welcome to a new season of Interpreting India. With geopolitical realignments, sustainable growth, healthcare financing, inclusive digital transformations, climate change, supply chain disruptions, urbanization, and several other critical global matters envelop the world as India holds the G20 presidency. We at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. My name is Konark Bhandari, and I will be your host for this episode of Interpreting India. In this episode, we will be looking at the semiconductor ecosystem. As you all may be aware, the U.S. India Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, called iCET, was launched during the sidelines of the Quad Summit in Tokyo during May 2022. The purpose of the iCET was to expand the partnership in critical and emerging technologies, including in semiconductors. As part of the iCET, the Semiconductor Industry Association, the SIA, in the US and India's India Electronic Semiconductor Association, called the IESA, agreed to undertake a readiness assessment to identify near-term industry opportunities and facilitate the longer-term strategic development of the contemporary semiconductor ecosystems. The Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, the ITIF, a Washington, D.C. based science and technology policy think tank, was commissioned to undertake authorship of this assessment. To give us insight into these issues around the semiconductor ecosystem and much more, I'm delighted to be speaking with Stephen Ezell of the ITIF. Stephen is Vice President for Global Innovation Policy at the ITIF and the Director of ITIF's Center for Life Sciences Innovation. He also leads the Global Trade and Innovation Policy Alliance. His areas of expertise include science and technology policy, international competitiveness, trade, and manufacturing. Stephen is also the co-author of Innovating in a Service-Driven Economy, Insights, Application, and Practice, as well as Innovation Economics, The Race for Global Advantage. Stephen, welcome to Interpreting India.
Thank you, Konark.
So, Stephen, my first question to you is about something you've written about quite a bit, which is essentially, in addition to the rapid buildup of domestic manufacturing capacity spurred by the U.S. CHIPS Act, tax credits, and incentives, the intensification of U.S. tensions and the imposition of export controls are encouraging many multinational technology companies to relocate production and assembly outside of China. Now, my question here is, given all that has happened in the last 5-6 months, especially with regard to American companies thinking about possibly offshoring to India or thinking about opening R&D centers, do you think the recent announcements made by Micron, AMD, Applied Materials, and Lam Research, especially when it comes to their India operations, reflects the start of a trend to gradually move some operations to India?
Well, Konark, that's a great question. And I think its answer involves two parts. The first part of your question, really is about, is there a move out of China by foreign multinational corporations? And I think that there is increasingly strong evidence of this. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce in China, their annual report at the start of this year noted, quote, nearly twice as many U.S. companies cut their investments in China in 2022 as opposed to the year before. 1/3 of their respondents reported that they were planning to, quote, redirect planned investments we were going to make in China in 2022 to other countries. So combining, obviously, the geopolitical tensions with the continuing COVID-19 lockdowns in China, as well as the reality that manufacturing labor costs have substantially risen in China in recent years, I think we are beginning to see a broader shift, at least to a China plus one strategy on the part of multinational corporations. And they're certainly looking at alternative sources of production and supply outside of China. So yes, I do think this portends a phenomenal opportunity for India at this point in time, not just in semiconductors, not just in ICTs or electronics, but across a wide swath of manufacturing activity, including, green energy, the automotive, motorcycles, et cetera. It's a real opportunity. And yeah, so you mentioned the recent announcements made in the semiconductor sector, specifically from Micron, AMD, Applied, Lam, et cetera. So yes, I think this does signal the start of a trend. I know we'll get more later on in this conversation into India's strategies to attract semiconductor manufacturing. Obviously, a very aggressive set of policies put forward by the India Semiconductor Mission, very attractive incentive packages, which are starting to bear some fruit. But as I'll say later, if India really wants to take advantage of this opportunity, it's not just about putting dollar signs out there to attract investors through PLI. It's through making sure India has every facet of its business and finance and regulatory structure in place, from tax to customs to tariffs to regulations, that make India one of the world's most attractive places to do business for companies in any industry.
Thank you for that, Stephen. You spoke briefly about the Indian Semiconductor Mission, and I think my next question is going to sort of probably speak to its role in guiding investments into the Indian semiconductor ecosystem. Something which I would like to bring up to the notice of our audience here is that the U.S. Chips and Science Act essentially includes a $500 million fund, which is called the Chips for America International Technology Security and Innovation Fund, also the ITSI fund. Now, in your recent interim report on semiconductor readiness assessment for India, it was noted that a not so insignificant share of these funds should be allocated to partnerships with Indian stakeholders and, of course, possibly other coordination partners as well. Now, the key question is, Stephen, how do you think these funds can be utilized?
Well, I think optimally, these funds can be used for education and for setting up kind of shared test bed prototyping infrastructures. So, for instance, in the interim report we delivered in June for the iCET, we noted that one thing this CHIPS money could do among Quad nation partners is to support both design and foundry interest by establishing a joint prototyping testbed foundry that could be used as a way to validate innovative chip designs. Because what happens now, especially when we look at the design element of semiconductor production, you have all these innovative companies in Silicon Valley and India, all around the world, and they come up with an innovative chip design. But you got to get it printed. You got to get it fabricated. So what do? Well, you call the leaders, you call TSMC or Intel and say, hey, can you print this chip for us? And they say, well, what's your production run? Like, well, it's just, we're testing it. And, they're doing million unit chip volumes for Apple or Qualcomm, right? So then there's a gap in the ecosystem to have like a prototyping testbed facility where we can support some of these small innovative chip designers with kind of these initial test runs. So that's one idea I think that could be done with this money in part between U.S. India and other Quad partners. Another set of recommendations we have is to stand up a world-class research and development center and test and characterization facility for the development of embedded systems and semiconductor products. These EMCs, or electronic manufacturing centers, could be set up as domain-specific centers of excellence in manufacturing, and as many as 25 EMCs, we believe, could be established in India with as little as $3 million in funding. Other uses of this money could be to develop a comprehensive cross-country semiconductor supply chain value map and to work on joint curriculum development in advanced electrical engineering, computer engineering courses, and support student exchanges between the U.S. and India at the master's and PhD levels in relevant engineering fields. So I think a lot that can be done if this money is put to good use.
So, Stephen, you mentioned towards the end of your answer something about a cross-country semiconductor value map. And that leads me to my next question, which is essentially about friendshoring, which is this term which has been coined in the last couple of years about like-minded countries coming together in the supply chain, be it for semiconductors or be it for other components and electronic materials as well. Now, my question here is, how will semiconductor companies make up for the shortfall in revenue resulting from restrictions on exporting advanced semiconductor equipment to China. The thing is that the Chinese market represents around $300 billion in revenue for a lot of the semiconductor companies. And India is currently at the moment not quite at that level when it comes to export potential to India. India is expected to have an $80 billion market for semiconductors by 2026. And this will probably at that point in time represent less than 10% of the global market share, which is expected to be around $1 trillion by 2030. So my question here is, how do India and like-minded nations that seek to band together under a Friendshoring initiative, be it the iCET, be it the Chip for Alliance, which India is not a part of, or the EU, India, and the US, EU Trade and Technology Councils, how will all these Friendshoring initiatives fill this void?
It's a very important, difficult question. But if we're going to crack this nut, I think we have to be thinking about the challenge at a much higher geopolitical and geostrategic level. So the reality today is that 36% of U.S. semiconductor sales go to China. But the broader, and by the way, China accounts for 40% of global ICT and electronics production today. But the reality is that in 2003, China only accounted for 8% of global high-tech output, including in ICTs. But from 2003 to 2019, China's share of global high-tech output increased from 8% to 27%, right? A 400% increase. Similarly, if we look at each year of the 1970s, India's economy was 2/3 more productive than China's over that decade. Over the past decade, China's economy has been 2/3 more productive than India's year over year. The point I'm trying to make is that we take the situation today as a fait accompli, as the way it is. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I say this because the way we have to deal with this challenge is to imagine a world where in a decade we can say, only 10 to 15% of America's semiconductor sales have to go to China because we are making ICT and electronics goods in other parts of the world. So many of the semiconductors sold into China today are not for the final use in China, but they're for incorporation into a device like a smartphone that is exported out to the rest of the world. If we are making those smartphones, those tablets, those laptops, those mouses, those iPads, those AI devices, whatever, in democratic, like-minded countries in South Africa, in South America, in Africa, in India, in Southeast Asia, then that's how we solve that problem. So I think what many people miss in this whole friendshoring thing is that they're seeing what they mean by friendshoring is they're looking at value chains. They're looking at where's the production coming from. But the real question isn't that. The real question is where's the final demand going to come from, right? So where are we selling these things in ultimately? So if we can bring, 1.3 billion well-off Indian consumers into the global economy, millions more from South America, then we solve both sides of this equation. So not just where it's produced, it's where it's consumed. And we have much more of this happen in free societies because that drives the economic growth we need, the market growth we need, and then we broadly decrease our dependence on China. That's the only way to circle this square.
Stephen, that's a great answer. I'll just add on to this in the form of a question. The thing is that in the next few years, there may not be a potential alternative to China. Yes, these friendshoring initiatives are all, basically just that, initiatives. And I think these are attempts to gradually sort of onshore certain parts of the value chain back to different countries. But in the meantime, until that happens, how do these companies, which have sort of been hit by the US export controls and sort of been prevented from selling to China, how will these companies plow money into their R&D activities? The thing is that these companies, once they stop selling to China, may not be able to make it back to China. The reason I say that is because there have been news reports how SMIC in China has now managed to make 7-nanometer chips using DOV machines, and the recent launch of the Huawei Mate 60 Pro shows that other local suppliers may have managed to fill in the gap vacated by American suppliers. So the question is, in the meantime, how do these companies, American companies to be specific, plow the money which they would have gotten, but now which has been foregone into R&D activities?
Well, I think my answer to that question is going to be an extension to your previous question. Because here is the fundamental long-term reality. We just said 36% of U.S. semiconductor industry sales go to China. The CCP wants that number to be 0%. The number of Boeing or Airbus airplanes China wants to buy is 0%. The number of robotics, of machine tools, of solar panels, of wind turbines. China, in our view at ITIF, fundamentally seeks an economic strategy of autarky, meaning domestic self-sufficiency in all advanced technology industries, of course, while still having unfettered access to global markets for its exports, right? So in our view, broadly, if you look at the evolution of China's economic strategy over the past 30 years, we contend that it has evolved from an initial attraction strategy under Deng Xiaoping, the 1980s, especially trying to attract the foreign investment. As China got more of it, got more of kind of a center of gravity for market demand, it entered what we called a compulsion phase, meaning it would start to say to companies, okay, if you want to sell into China, then you have to transfer technology. You have to transfer intellectual property. You have to produce here as a condition of market access. This was in China called trading technology for market. But what we're seeing now is a move from attraction to compulsion to expulsion. So now when China has a satisfactory domestic competitor in a certain marketplace, it starts to expel the foreign competitors. And a great example of this is what was called in China the DIOE strategy. And this meant D Intel, D Oracle, and D EMC, which was like a enterprise solutions provider. So once China's got a domestic player, it starts to kick the foreign companies out. So what I'm trying to say is, I think foreign players have to understand that China is actively wanting to decrease their ability to sell into this marketplace over time and to develop long-term strategies to be prepared for that reality. Now, coming back to the present, because you rightfully say that, yes, just like any advanced technology industry, right, in the life sciences, it's the profits from a cholesterol or a diabetes drug that companies earn that they can then reinvest into future generations of innovation to solve a cancer or COVID-19. So just the same in the semiconductor industry, it's the profits from the 14 nanometer fab that beget the money to invest in the 7 nanometer and the 3 nanometer, the 2 nanometer. So the reality is companies have to earn revenues to invest in future generations of R&D. And again, the only way out of this box is if we're creating other markets outside China that these companies long-term can sell into to get the revenues to reinvest in R&D. The other side of the equation would be to continue to work with like-minded countries to prevail upon China that as a member of the World Trade Organization, they have committed to other countries and the rest of the international community that they will conduct their economic affairs in accordance with the foundational WTO principles of rules-governed market-based trade in adherence with the fundamental principles of national treatment, reciprocity, and non-discrimination. That was the deal, right? You join the WTO, you have access to global markets, but you give foreign companies the right to compete in your market on non-discriminatory terms. If that's not going to be the case, then I think that we're in for a disruptive period in the global economy.
All right. One of the things India has been trying to get up and running is a fabrication ecosystem in India when it comes to semiconductors. These companies which have announced plans to invest into India have focused on the end of assembly and packaging and chip design and workforce training. But something which is not there, which at the moment at least is something which is an investment in a fabrication facility. Now, what do you make of arguments which are often put forth by certain experts that, fabrication facility is too ambitious, India should start off with ATMP facilities to begin with? Do you see these as valid arguments? Is the accomplishment of setting up an ATMP facility and a fabrication facility mutually exclusive?
Connor, my view is that no, the goal of attracting investment in assembly, test, and packaging, or in fabrication, these are not mutually exclusive. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. These can happen together. Now, where I think I do agree is, when you think about making semiconductors, this is truly one of the most complex manufacturing processes that exists in humankind, if not the most complex manufacturing process. The newest fabs that are coming online, the 2-3 nanometer stuff, these are $30 billion investments, right? Now I know for legacy stuff, 28, 56, that's not, the price tag for that is single digit billions. Point I'm trying to make is I do think there's an argument to be made, and perhaps that exists among the multinational corporations in this sector, that India's ability to effectively operate an ATP facility, it represents a proof point. It represents a first step. Show us you can do that. That all works well. Then we have a lot more confidence that we can make these types of investments for a much more expensive semiconductor fab in India. So I don't think they're exclusive, but I do think there is perhaps sentiment in the community that show us you can do ATP, and then we'll be much more inclined to believe that you can really do the fab at the highest levels.
That makes sense. So it seems almost like these investments which have been announced and how they'll be treated by the Indian government will serve as a proof of concept for any further investments down the line. Okay.
Tip of the spear argument, yeah.
Right. Okay. Just one more thing now, moving on to the issue of subsidies and financial incentives. So I know that you've spoken about tax credits being a big thing when it comes to providing incentive to semiconductor companies. But I just want to ask, for those of our viewers who are just who'll be listening to this podcast, why the preference for tax credits? Why not grants? Why not loans? Why not equity? Why this particular form of financial investment?
Well, so if you look at the U.S. CHIPS Act, what that included was essentially about the $39 billion of grants, $12 billion roughly for R&D, and then there was a separate ITC or investment tax credit that our Congressional Budget Office scored at being at about $24 billion. The reason I think the tax credits are an attractive instrument is, with the subsidies on the $39 billion on the chip side, you got to go through a multi-year potentially application process. You don't know if you're going to get it. You don't know what amount you're going to get. You don't know who you're going to have to partner with. You don't know what the conditions are. But with an ITC, knowing that you can take a 25% credit on your investments, that's there. That's certain. You can go and start putting the shovel in the ground tomorrow, immediately, not having to wait a year or two and go through that process. You can move immediately with certainty that money is going to be available to you, and that makes a big difference for the finances and the shareholders of these companies, et cetera. Also, I think again, we talked about very large investments, multi-billion dollars. These aren't insignificant financial undertakings for companies, right? So if you have that certainty that, I have this 25% credit, that's just, and I know it's there, I know I can get it immediately, then that's just much more certain, at least the way our financial and taxation system works in the United States. Now, in India, listen, as I said before, a lot to like, with the PLI, the production linked incentive scheme. With Micron, the investment they're going to make in the ATP, it sounds, as I understand, that as much as 50% of that investment might be written off by the federal government, maybe 20% more by the relevant state. So you get 70% up front. That's a wonderful deal for Micron to take. And it does achieve that tip of the spear argument. But the problem with this, right, is it's not sustainable. Right, you get one, you get two. That money runs out fairly quickly. India doesn't just need one or two shiny objects. It doesn't need a couple of Lamborghinis in the garage. It needs a whole ecosystem that's deep and broad and sustainable over time. And just throwing dollars at the problem doesn't get you there. But the tax credit, that it is throwing dollars. I agree, but it can be an even level playing field instrument that all companies can take, and I just think it's worth more countries considering it more seriously.
Well, I guess the issue of tax credits has not really gotten sufficient attention here in India, to be honest. And I think this segues into something else as well. That something we take for granted in India is that we have a robust talent pool when it comes to chip design engineers, and the government has focused on that. But for whatever reason, and I think maybe you can come in here and tell us about why this is not really taken off, there's not sufficient presence of Indian companies in the chip design ecosystem. I mean, there's this often quoted number that 30% of the global chip design talent resides in India. At the same time, India has not been able to leverage this talent pool into a viable ecosystem for local chip design. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that the local chip design ecosystem in India has lagged that of its global peers?
That's an interesting question. It seems to me when I hear stuff like this, is the problem more the lack of venture capital? Is the problem more lack of just startup, founder depth? That the input side may explain part of the problem. I think another challenge, what are these chip design people? I mean, they're working for Texas Instruments, right? They're working for Intel. They're working for, large multinational semiconductor companies. And what does that matter? It matters because those companies have the relationships with the end users, right? In a lot of cases. And it's hard for any company, a startup company, to recreate those final customer relationships with the people, Qualcomm or Broadcom or whoever is using ultimately the thing itself. So maybe just part of the problem is there with the channel. It's interesting that so much chip design activity does occur, as you said, in India, but that so much of that continues to happen under the MNC house as opposed to the Indian startup house. And I would suspect it's kind of market structure factors that are somehow driving that.
All right. I think this also ties into the issue of trade as well. That's often neglected. Because we spoke about subsidies, we spoke about, this has to be sustainable in the long run. You just can't offer a one-time massive subsidy and then hope that it will continue. But one argument often brought forward by observers is that India's absence from a large trade bloc like the RCEP or the RCEP is something which might be a stumbling block to India sort of getting, others to relocate their operations to India. So my issue is how significant a role does trade policy, or at least, I mean, if I may be specific here, how badly does India's absence from the RCEP hurt India when it comes to semiconductor supply chains?
Well, I would say trade policy is a significant factor in companies' investment decisions. I was talking with one company the other day, and they, it's a semiconductor manufacturer, a large one, and they were saying that when they decide to invest somewhere, they have a checklist of 489 factors that each country and region and community they're in has got to check off all 489, right? That's what you have to do to compete in the global economy today, right? Every little detail matters. And if the trade regimes a country is part of are or are not making it conducive to move parts, components, and inputs in and out of a country, yes, it's a factor. But with regard to trade policy, what I see as a significantly more significant stumbling block for India than RCEP is the Information Technology Agreement. the ITA. This is a WTO agreement that counts 82 members, and it eliminates tariffs on trade in covered iCT goods. It started in 1996. It was expanded in 2015. Now, India is a member of the original ITA, but not the expanded ITA or ITA2. And the reality with semiconductors is we're dealing with the world's fourth most traded product. And as you know, making these things requires the movement of wafers across the global supply chain, a wide range of inputs, components, cables, boards, fiber, all this stuff, right? So the point is, if countries don't offer a zero in, zero out tariff environment to move all these things you have to move to make a semiconductor, then yes, it's going to make a country less competitive. And so, every dollar India applies on like 10% tariffs on PCBs, printed circuit boards, that's just a cost factor that companies are going to consider, and it militates against the decision to make investments in India. By the way, this is why countries that are not in the Information Technology Agreement have seen their participation in global value chains for the production of ICTs decline by 70% since the ITA entered force in 1995. If you don't offer a zero in, zero out tariff environment, you simply get circumvented in global production chains for ICT goods. So the most important thing I would counsel India to do in this regard is to join the Information Technology Agreement 2, as well as to consider joining an ITA 3. The global community is now starting to look at an expanded list of products that might be in an ITA 3. We released at ITIF a report yesterday called How an ITA 3 Can Drive a Nation's Economic Growth. And we found that if India were to join an ITA 3 alone, it could increase its economy by 2.5% over a decade. And the amount of tariffs India, the amount of tax revenue from this expanded economic growth India could realize would be more than twice as much as the tariffs it's forgone. So broadly, I would encourage India to be a more active player in these global trade agreements, whether ITA 2, 3, and as well as RCEP. But I think RCEP is less of a stumbling block than ITA.
Well, yeah, with that being said, I think we'll just talk briefly about, or at least I'll segue to a different question now, which is about how this weekend India hosted the G20 event in New Delhi, and President Biden came down to India as well. And they discussed certain issues in the bilateral relationship, including the iCET. One thing which was, at least seen in the joint statement or joint declaration issued by the Indian and the Americans was that they actually took stock of all the investments announced during the June visit of PM Modi to Washington. And I'm paraphrasing here, but I think it said that they're satisfied with the progress made when it comes to the likes of Micron and AMD and, Applied Materials and Lam Research. My question is, Stephen, that given that all we have discussed today on trade policy, subsidies, tax credits, and the local talent pool, how would you actually rate India's readiness to receive more investments? That's essentially what you have, done in June, and you'll be, of course, coming out with the full report soon on the readiness assessment for Indian semiconductor ecosystem. My question here is, how do you take into account that statement in the joint declaration or the joint statement, which speaks about how the progress on these investments has been satisfactory versus what we just heard about India being sort of absent from trade partnerships, trade blocs, ITA2? How do you possibly square that up?
Well, I recently visited India doing research for this report, and one of the themes I constantly heard from Indian government officials was the commitment that they were making to move India from a country of red tape to red carpet. And I think as long as that continues to be the mindset, as long as that rhetoric is matched by reality, by action, as long as reforms continue to happen to improve the business environment, have clear, consistent, reliable taxation policy, not doing retroactive taxation, for instance, making sure that there's single window customs clearance, then yes, I think that there is a significant level of readiness in the Indian economy to become a much more active player in global semiconductor production. But it needs to be consistent. It needs to be across the board. We've seen cases where, we've one supplier coming in and they cut all these deals for the no tariffs on their inputs into a special economic zone, for instance. Okay, yeah, but that's a political deal that may or may not last across administrations, right? It needs to be institutionalized, systemic, available to all players, and a focus not just on shiny objects, but deep ecosystems.
That's a great point, Stephen. I think I'll just end here on the note that I recently read a press report about how while Micron has been given these substantive subsidies to sort of move its operations in ATMP to Gujarat in India, at the same time, a lot of the other suppliers in the same value chain which supply to Micron are now also asking for the same financial incentives. So you have the likes of Simtech saying to the government that, listen, we would not move unless you offer us the same incentives, and we are pretty much the part of the same Micron supply chain. So how can you possibly offer them the incentives and not us? So I completely couldn't be more in agreement with you when you say that these incentives have to be more sustainable, more long term, and it can't be just a one-off thing. So on that note, thank you, Stephen, for joining us, and
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also visit us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. See you next time.